In the turbulent landscape of post-apartheid South Africa, as the nation struggled to rebuild itself and address decades of systemic violence and inequality, a new kind of terror emerged that would grip the country in fear. Moses Sithole, who would become known as the ABC Killer, embarked on a killing spree that claimed the lives of over 38 women and children between 1994 and 1995, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in African history. Moses Sithole was born on November 17, 1964, in the impoverished township of Notorious, east of Johannesburg, during the height of apartheid's oppressive regime. His early life unfolded against the backdrop of institutionalized racism, economic deprivation, and social upheaval that characterized black townships under apartheid rule. These conditions would later be analyzed by criminologists as crucial factors in shaping the psychological landscape that enabled his transformation into a serial killer. The Sithole family lived in extreme poverty, crowded into a small shack with limited access to basic amenities like running water or electricity. Moses was the eldest of 5 children, born to parents who struggled to provide for their family under the harsh economic restrictions imposed by apartheid laws. His father worked sporadically in the mines when employment was available, while his mother took in washing and cleaning to supplement their meager income. From an early age, Moses experienced the trauma of abandonment and rejection that would profoundly impact his psychological development. When he was just 5 years old, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise 5 children alone in desperate circumstances. This abandonment created deep psychological wounds that festered throughout his childhood and adolescence. The absence of his father created a void that was filled by a series of his mother's boyfriends, many of whom were abusive toward both Moses and his mother. He witnessed domestic violence regularly, learning that physical force was an acceptable way to exert control over others, particularly women. These early experiences with violence and power dynamics would later manifest in his treatment of victims. School offered little refuge from the chaos of his home life. The apartheid education system provided inferior schooling for black children, and Moses attended overcrowded, under-resourced schools where individual attention was impossible. Teachers later recalled him as a withdrawn, angry child who struggled academically and socially. He frequently displayed aggressive behavior toward classmates and showed little respect for authority figures. The combination of abandonment, poverty, exposure to violence, and educational neglect created the perfect storm for psychological dysfunction. Criminal psychologists who later studied his case identified classic markers of conduct disorder in his childhood behavior: cruelty to animals, fire setting, persistent lying, and aggressive behavior toward peers. These early warning signs, unfortunately, went unrecognized and untreated in the chaotic environment of township life. The event that many experts believe served as the primary catalyst for Sithole's later violent behavior occurred when he was 7 years old. He was sexually assaulted by a group of older boys in his township, an experience that left him with profound psychological scars and a deep-seated rage against the world. The sexual assault occurred in an abandoned building where Moses had been playing alone. The attackers, all teenagers from his neighborhood, subjected him to repeated sexual violence over several hours before leaving him traumatized and bleeding. In the conservative, masculine culture of the township, such victimization was seen as deeply shameful, and Moses felt unable to tell anyone about what had happened to him. The psychological impact of this assault cannot be overstated. For a young boy already struggling with abandonment issues and living in poverty, this traumatic experience shattered what little sense of safety and trust he had managed to maintain. The assault left him feeling powerless, humiliated, and consumed with rage that had no appropriate outlet for expression. In the aftermath of the assault, Moses's behavior became increasingly disturbed. He began exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, flashbacks, and periods of dissociation. His academic performance declined further, and he became increasingly isolated from his peers. The anger that had been building inside him began to manifest in more serious antisocial behaviors. Criminal psychologists who later analyzed his case noted that sexual victimization in childhood is often a significant factor in the development of serial killers, particularly those who target victims of the same gender as their attackers. The powerlessness experienced during the assault often creates a psychological need to regain control through violence against others, typically those perceived as even more vulnerable than the perpetrator. The lack of mental health resources in the township meant that Moses received no treatment or counseling for his trauma. Instead, he was left to process these devastating experiences alone, allowing his anger and psychological dysfunction to fester and grow throughout his formative years. As Moses entered his teenage years, his psychological problems became increasingly apparent to those around him. The combination of his traumatic experiences and the ongoing stresses of township life had created a young man consumed with anger and completely lacking in empathy for others. His first recorded interaction with the criminal justice system came at age 14 when he was arrested for theft. This initial offense was relatively minor, stealing food from a local shop, but it marked the beginning of an escalating pattern of criminal behavior. The theft appeared to be motivated not just by hunger, but by a growing sense that society owed him something and that rules didn't apply to him. Throughout his mid-teens, Moses's criminal activities became more frequent and more serious. He was arrested multiple times for theft, assault, and vandalism. Each arrest was followed by brief periods in juvenile detention facilities that were overcrowded, understaffed, and focused more on punishment than rehabilitation. These experiences only served to further harden his antisocial attitudes and provide him with education in more sophisticated criminal techniques. During this period, Moses also began to display increasingly disturbing attitudes toward women and girls. Fellow township residents later recalled his inappropriate comments and behavior toward females of all ages. He seemed to view women as objects to be controlled and dominated, an attitude that reflected both his traumatic experiences and the patriarchal culture of the township. His relationship with his mother became increasingly strained during his adolescence. She struggled to control his behavior while dealing with her own problems, including periods of depression and relationships with abusive men. Moses began to blame her for many of his problems, particularly his father's abandonment, developing a deep resentment that would later influence his choice of victims. The educational system had essentially given up on Moses by the time he reached high school age. His attendance was sporadic, his grades were failing, and his behavior was disruptive enough that teachers preferred when he didn't come to class. Without the structure and positive influences that education might have provided, he spent increasing amounts of time on the streets, associating with other troubled youth and learning more sophisticated criminal techniques. By his early 20s, Moses Sithole had developed into a career criminal whose activities were becoming increasingly violent and predatory. The transition from petty crime to more serious offenses reflected his growing psychological dysfunction and his escalating need for control and dominance over others. In 1987, at age 23, Moses was arrested for rape, his first recorded sexual offense. The victim was a young woman from his township whom he had approached with promises of employment. After luring her to an isolated location, he sexually assaulted her and beat her severely when she attempted to resist. This crime displayed many of the characteristics that would later define his serial killing career: the use of deception to lure victims, the targeting of economically vulnerable women, and the extreme violence used to exert control. The rape conviction resulted in a 7-year prison sentence, Moses's first extended period of incarceration. Prison life in apartheid-era South Africa was brutal, particularly for black inmates, and the experience further damaged his already fragmented psyche. Rather than receiving any form of rehabilitation or mental health treatment, he was subjected to a dehumanizing environment that only reinforced his antisocial attitudes. During his imprisonment, Moses was subjected to violence from both guards and fellow inmates. He was sexually assaulted multiple times, experiences that reopened the psychological wounds from his childhood trauma. However, rather than developing empathy for other victims of sexual violence, these experiences seemed to reinforce his belief that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that survival required becoming the predator. He used his time in prison to study other inmates, learning from their criminal techniques and psychological manipulation strategies. He became particularly interested in how serial offenders operated, studying cases that had been discussed among the prison population. This period represented a crucial phase in his criminal education, as he absorbed lessons that would later make him a more effective predator. Prison psychologists who evaluated Moses during his incarceration noted his complete lack of remorse for his crimes and his inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. Their reports described him as manipulative, narcissistic, and potentially dangerous, but these warnings would not be properly acted upon when he was eventually released. Moses Sithole was released from prison in 1994, emerging into a South Africa that was undergoing dramatic political and social transformation. The end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela as president had created a new nation, but the transition period was marked by high crime rates, economic uncertainty, and social upheaval that provided perfect cover for a predator like Sithole. The newly democratic South Africa was struggling to establish effective law enforcement systems that could handle the massive crime wave sweeping the country. Police resources were stretched thin, communication between different jurisdictions was poor, and many communities remained largely unpoliced. These systemic weaknesses would prove crucial in allowing Sithole's killing spree to continue for as long as it did. Upon his release, Moses initially attempted to present himself as a reformed individual. He found employment with a railway company and seemed to be making an effort to integrate into legitimate society. However, this period of apparent normalcy was merely a facade that concealed his growing psychological deterioration and planning for future crimes. His job with the railway company provided him with several advantages that would later prove crucial to his criminal career. It gave him legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, allowed him to become familiar with remote locations where bodies could be disposed of, and provided him with a veneer of respectability that helped him gain the trust of potential victims. During this period, Moses began to develop what would become his signature method of operation. He would approach young women and girls, typically those who appeared to be from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, with offers of employment or other opportunities. His experience in prison had taught him to be more sophisticated in his approach, and he developed considerable skill at identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of potential victims. The psychological pressure that had been building within him throughout his imprisonment began to intensify after his release. The combination of his traumatic childhood experiences, his prison victimization, and his complete inability to form healthy relationships created an internal rage that demanded outlet through violence against others. The first murder attributed to Moses Sithole occurred in August 1994, just months after his release from prison. The victim was a young woman named Amanda Thithe, whom he had approached with promises of employment. He lured her to a remote location where he sexually assaulted her before strangling her to death. The murder of Amanda Thithe established a pattern that would characterize all of Sithole's subsequent crimes. He targeted young women from poor backgrounds who were desperate for employment opportunities. He used his charm and apparent respectability to gain their trust, lured them to isolated locations, sexually assaulted them, and then killed them to eliminate witnesses to his crimes. What made Sithole particularly dangerous was his methodical approach to murder. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively, he demonstrated careful planning and preparation for each crime. He would scout potential victims for days, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities before making his approach. His second confirmed victim was discovered 3 weeks later in a different jurisdiction, leading investigators to initially treat the murders as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial killer. This lack of coordination between police agencies would prove to be a crucial factor in allowing Sithole's killing spree to continue unchecked. The early murders were characterized by extreme brutality that went far beyond what was necessary to kill the victims. Sithole appeared to derive psychological satisfaction from the pain and terror he inflicted, suggesting that the murders served deeper psychological needs than simple elimination of witnesses. Criminal profilers who later studied his case identified clear signs of sexual sadism and a need for complete domination over his victims. The geographical spread of the early murders created additional challenges for investigators. Sithole deliberately targeted victims in different townships and provinces, understanding that poor communication between police jurisdictions would make it difficult to connect the crimes. This strategic thinking demonstrated a criminal intelligence that made him far more dangerous than many serial killers who operate impulsively. As the killing spree continued through late 1994 and into 1995, investigators began to notice a disturbing pattern in the locations where bodies were being discovered. Many of the victims were found near railway stations in towns whose names began with the letters A, B, or C, leading to Sithole being dubbed the ABC Killer by the media. The ABC pattern was not coincidental but reflected Sithole's methodical nature and his familiarity with the railway system from his employment. He was using his legitimate job as cover for his criminal activities, traveling to different locations under the guise of work-related business while actually scouting for victims and disposal sites. Towns like Atarajevo, Benoni, and Cleveland became synonymous with terror as bodies continued to be discovered in their vicinity. The pattern provided investigators with their first real clue about the killer's possible connection to the railway system, though it would take months before this insight led to his identification. The media attention generated by the ABC pattern had the unintended consequence of increasing public fear while also potentially warning Sithole that police were beginning to connect his crimes. However, rather than deterring him, the notoriety seemed to fuel his ego and encourage him to continue killing. Criminal psychologists noted that many serial killers derive satisfaction from the fear they generate and the attention their crimes receive. During this period, the number of murders escalated dramatically. What had begun as isolated killings occurring every few weeks became a nearly constant stream of violence, with new bodies being discovered almost weekly. The acceleration in killing frequency suggested that Sithole's psychological needs were intensifying and that each murder was providing diminishing satisfaction, requiring more frequent kills to achieve the same psychological release. The victims during this period ranged in age from 10 to 45, though most were young women in their teens and 20s. They came from various townships throughout the Gauteng and surrounding provinces, united only by their economic desperation and their tragic encounter with a predator who exploited their vulnerability. The investigation into the ABC murders represented one of the largest manhunts in South African criminal history. Led by the South African Police Service's newly formed Serial Crime Unit, the investigation brought together resources and expertise from across the country in an unprecedented effort to identify and capture the killer. The breakthrough came through a combination of traditional detective work and emerging forensic techniques. Investigators had noticed that many of the victims had been approached by a man claiming to work for a charitable organization that helped unemployed women find work. This consistent modus operandi provided police with their first concrete lead about the killer's method of approach. Working with railway company employment records and cross-referencing them with the geographical pattern of the murders, investigators were able to identify Moses Sithole as a person of interest. His criminal history, particularly his previous rape conviction, made him an obvious suspect once his name emerged from the employment records. The investigation was complicated by the poor state of police records and communication systems in the newly democratic South Africa. Many case files were incomplete or missing, and coordination between different police agencies was often inadequate. Despite these challenges, the dedicated work of investigators gradually built a compelling case against Sithole. Forensic evidence also played a crucial role in linking Sithole to the crimes. DNA analysis, still a relatively new technique in South African law enforcement, was used to connect him to multiple crime scenes. Physical evidence including clothing fibers and fingerprints further strengthened the case against him. The investigation also benefited from the cooperation of surviving victims who had managed to escape from Sithole's attacks. Their descriptions of their attacker and his methods provided investigators with valuable insights into his personality and approach. These survivor testimonies would later prove crucial in securing his conviction. As evidence mounted against Moses Sithole, police launched an intensive manhunt to locate and arrest him. The search was complicated by his intimate knowledge of the railway system and his ability to move quickly between different jurisdictions. He had also become aware that police were closing in on him and had gone into hiding. The manhunt received extensive media coverage, with Sithole's photograph broadcast on television and published in newspapers throughout South Africa. The publicity generated numerous tips from the public, though most proved to be false leads that consumed valuable investigative resources. During this period, Sithole continued to kill, demonstrating either a complete disregard for the danger he was in or a psychological compulsion that overrode his survival instincts. The murders during the manhunt period showed signs of increasing desperation and disorganization, suggesting that the pressure was beginning to affect his psychological state. Police established roadblocks at railway stations and maintained surveillance on locations where previous murders had occurred. The massive operation involved hundreds of officers and represented one of the largest law enforcement efforts in post-apartheid South African history. The search was further complicated by Sithole's ability to blend into the predominantly black townships where he was hiding. In the crowded, poorly documented communities, it was relatively easy for him to avoid detection by assuming false identities and relying on the protection of people who were naturally suspicious of police authority. The breakthrough in the manhunt came when Sithole made contact with a journalist, apparently seeking to tell his side of the story. This decision to reach out to the media demonstrated both his narcissistic need for attention and a significant error in judgment that would ultimately lead to his capture. On October 18, 1995, Moses Sithole was finally captured by police in a dramatic operation that brought an end to one of the most intensive manhunts in South African history. His capture came about through his own mistake in contacting a journalist, which allowed police to trace his location and move in for the arrest. The arrest took place at a hideout in Benoni, ironically one of the B towns that had given him his nickname. When police surrounded the building, Sithole initially attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended. He was found in possession of items belonging to several of his victims, providing additional physical evidence linking him to the crimes. The initial interrogation revealed the full scope of Sithole's crimes for the first time. Over several days of questioning, he confessed to 38 murders and 40 rapes, providing details that only the perpetrator could have known. His confessions painted a horrific picture of systematic violence against vulnerable women and children. What shocked investigators was not just the number of his crimes, but the calculated nature of his approach. Sithole described in detail how he would identify potential victims, study their routines, and plan his attacks. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view his victims as objects rather than human beings. The confessions also revealed the psychological motivations behind his crimes. Sithole spoke about his need for control and dominance, his anger toward women, and his belief that society owed him compensation for his difficult childhood. These statements provided valuable insights for criminal psychologists studying serial killer behavior. His capture brought relief to communities throughout South Africa that had lived in fear during his killing spree. The case had become a national obsession, and his arrest was front-page news in every major newspaper in the country. The trial of Moses Sithole began in 1996 and became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in post-apartheid South Africa. The case presented numerous challenges for the prosecution, including the need to present evidence from dozens of crime scenes and coordinate testimony from multiple jurisdictions. Sithole initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite his earlier confessions to police. His defense team argued that the confessions had been obtained under duress and should not be admissible in court. This strategy reflected a common defense tactic in serial killer cases, where defendants often recant their confessions once they face the reality of potential death sentences. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Sithole's own confessions. DNA evidence linked him to multiple crime scenes, while surviving victims provided powerful testimony about their encounters with him. The sheer volume of evidence made the prosecution's case overwhelming. During the trial, details of Sithole's crimes were presented in graphic detail, shocking even experienced court observers. The systematic nature of his violence and the vulnerability of his victims created an atmosphere of revulsion in the courtroom that clearly affected both the jury and the judge. Sithole's behavior during the trial alternated between attempts to appear remorseful and outbursts of anger when he felt he was not being treated with sufficient respect. This inconsistency reflected his narcissistic personality disorder and his inability to maintain a consistent facade for extended periods. The defense attempted to present evidence of Sithole's traumatic childhood and his own victimization as mitigating factors that might spare him from the death penalty. While this testimony provided context for his criminal behavior, it did little to generate sympathy given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the heinous nature of his crimes. On December 5, 1997, Moses Sithole was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 2,410 years in prison, effectively multiple life sentences that ensured he would never be released. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the systematic nature of his crimes and the particular vulnerability of his victims as factors justifying the harsh penalty. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the families of Sithole's victims, though many expressed frustration that South Africa had abolished the death penalty shortly before his trial. They felt that life imprisonment was insufficient punishment for someone who had caused so much pain and suffering. Sithole's transfer to Pretoria Central Prison marked the beginning of what would be a difficult period of adjustment to life behind bars. Unlike his earlier imprisonment, he was now a notorious figure whose crimes were known to both guards and fellow inmates. This notoriety made him a target for violence from other prisoners who despised crimes against women and children. His behavior in prison has been marked by continued attempts to manipulate staff and other inmates, though with limited success. Prison officials report that he remains unrepentant and continues to blame others for his circumstances. He has shown no genuine remorse for his crimes and continues to view himself as a victim of injustice. Over the years, Sithole has given numerous interviews to journalists and researchers, always presenting himself as misunderstood rather than acknowledging the harm he caused. These interviews have provided additional insights into his psychological makeup but have also demonstrated his continued narcissism and lack of empathy. He has made several appeals of his conviction, all of which have been unsuccessful. His legal team has argued various technical issues related to his trial, but the overwhelming evidence of his guilt has made these appeals futile exercises that have only served to reopen wounds for victims' families. The case of Moses Sithole has become a landmark study for criminal psychologists and forensic psychiatrists seeking to understand the development of serial killers in the African context. Multiple psychological evaluations conducted during his trial and imprisonment have provided unprecedented insights into the mind of one of Africa's most prolific serial killers. Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, South Africa's leading expert on serial crime, conducted extensive psychological assessments of Sithole that revealed a classic psychopathic personality structure combined with narcissistic and antisocial traits. The evaluations showed that Sithole possessed all the hallmarks of psychopathy: superficial charm, pathological lying, lack of empathy, and complete absence of remorse. The psychological analysis identified several key factors that contributed to Sithole's violent behavior. His childhood sexual assault created deep psychological wounds that never healed, while his abandonment by his father and exposure to domestic violence taught him that relationships were based on power and dominance rather than love and respect. The apartheid system itself was identified as a contributing factor, as the dehumanizing effects of institutionalized racism and economic oppression created an environment where violence was normalized and human life was devalued. This social context provided the backdrop against which Sithole's individual psychological problems developed into homicidal behavior. Perhaps most disturbing was the analysis of Sithole's victim selection process. He demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of social vulnerabilities, consistently targeting women who were economically desperate and socially marginalized. This predatory intelligence, combined with his complete lack of empathy, made him extraordinarily effective as a killer. The psychological profile also revealed the sexual sadism that motivated many of his crimes. Sithole derived psychological satisfaction not just from killing his victims, but from their suffering and terror. This sadistic element distinguished his crimes from those of killers who murder primarily to eliminate witnesses or for practical reasons. The Moses Sithole case had profound and lasting impacts on South African law enforcement, leading to significant reforms in how serial crimes are investigated and prosecuted. The difficulties experienced in tracking Sithole across multiple jurisdictions highlighted serious weaknesses in police communication and coordination systems. One of the most important changes was the establishment of the Investigative Psychology Unit within the South African Police Service. This specialized unit, modeled on similar organizations in the United States and Europe, was specifically created to handle serial crimes and develop psychological profiles of unknown offenders. The case also led to improvements in forensic science capabilities, including the expansion of DNA analysis facilities and the creation of computerized databases for tracking evidence across different cases. These technological advances made it possible to link crimes that might previously have been investigated as isolated incidents. Training programs for police investigators were substantially upgraded to include education about serial crime patterns and psychological profiling techniques. The Sithole case became a standard study in police academies throughout Southern Africa, providing future investigators with insights into how serial predators operate. Victim services also underwent significant improvements as a result of lessons learned from the case. The recognition that serial killers often target marginalized populations led to the development of specialized programs to protect vulnerable women and provide support services for survivors of violent crime. The case influenced legal reforms related to the prosecution of serial crimes, including changes in evidence rules that made it easier to present pattern evidence across multiple cases. These reforms helped prosecutors build stronger cases against serial offenders and improved conviction rates. International cooperation agreements were also strengthened, as the Sithole case demonstrated the need for better coordination when criminals operate across provincial and national boundaries. These agreements facilitated information sharing and joint operations that made it more difficult for serial offenders to evade capture. The Moses Sithole case generated unprecedented media attention in South Africa, becoming one of the first major criminal cases in the post-apartheid era to capture sustained public interest. The coverage played a crucial role in the investigation while also raising important questions about media ethics and the responsibility of journalists reporting on serial crimes. The intensive media coverage served several important functions during the investigation. It helped generate tips from the public that proved valuable in tracking Sithole's movements and identifying potential witnesses. The publicity also helped warn potential victims about the danger and encouraged people to report suspicious encounters. However, the media attention also had negative consequences. The sensationalized coverage sometimes interfered with the investigation by alerting Sithole to police activities and potentially influencing his behavior. Some reporting also contained inaccuracies that confused the public and complicated police efforts. The case highlighted the particular vulnerability of women in post-apartheid South Africa and drew attention to broader issues of gender-based violence that plagued the country. Feminist organizations used the coverage to advocate for better protection of women and more resources for combating violence against women. The media coverage also reflected and reinforced racial stereotypes that existed in South African society. The fact that both the perpetrator and most victims were black led to different coverage patterns than might have occurred if the crimes had crossed racial lines. The case became a cultural phenomenon that influenced literature, film, and television in South Africa. Numerous books and documentaries were produced about Sithole's crimes, contributing to public understanding while also sometimes exploiting the tragedy for commercial purposes. The long-term impact of the media coverage included increased public awareness of serial crime and greater support for law enforcement efforts to combat such offenses. However, it also contributed to moral panic about crime in general that continues to influence South African politics and social policy. Moses Sithole remains imprisoned at Pretoria Central Prison, where he continues to serve his multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. Now in his late 50s, he has spent over 2 decades behind bars, though his behavior and attitude remain largely unchanged from the time of his conviction. Prison officials report that Sithole continues to be a manipulative and difficult inmate who shows no genuine remorse for his crimes. He has been involved in several disciplinary incidents over the years, including conflicts with other inmates and attempts to manipulate prison staff for personal advantage. His health has declined somewhat with age, but he remains mentally sharp and continues to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He regularly writes letters to various officials claiming that he was framed and demanding a new trial, though these communications are largely ignored. Sithole has given numerous interviews over the years to journalists, researchers, and criminologists, always presenting himself as a victim of circumstances rather than acknowledging responsibility for his crimes. These interviews continue to provide insights into his psychological makeup while demonstrating his persistent narcissism and lack of empathy. He has attempted several legal challenges to his conviction and sentencing, all of which have been unsuccessful. His lawyers have argued various technical and constitutional issues, but the strength of the evidence against him has made these appeals exercises in futility. The families of his victims continue to be affected by his crimes decades later. Many have struggled with trauma and grief that never fully healed, and his continued presence serves as a constant reminder of their losses. Some family members have advocated for his execution, despite South Africa's abolition of the death penalty. The case of Moses Sithole continues to influence criminal justice practices, academic research, and social policy in South Africa more than 2 decades after his capture. His crimes serve as a watershed moment that exposed critical weaknesses in law enforcement and social services while highlighting the particular vulnerability of marginalized populations. From a criminological perspective, the Sithole case provided valuable insights into how serial killers develop and operate in the African context. The combination of individual psychological factors and broader social conditions demonstrated the complex interplay of personal and environmental influences that can create dangerous predators. The case highlighted the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and abuse. Sithole's history of sexual victimization, combined with family dysfunction and social deprivation, created a perfect storm of risk factors that might have been addressed through appropriate intervention programs. The investigation itself became a model for how serial crimes should be handled, demonstrating the importance of interagency cooperation, specialized training, and advanced forensic techniques. The lessons learned from tracking Sithole influenced the development of investigative protocols that continue to be used throughout Southern Africa. The case also contributed to broader discussions about violence against women in South Africa and the particular risks faced by economically disadvantaged women. Sithole's ability to exploit poverty and desperation highlighted the need for better social support systems and economic opportunities for vulnerable populations. Educational institutions throughout Africa now use the Sithole case as a teaching tool in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement programs. His crimes serve as a practical example of how various theoretical concepts apply in real-world situations. The legacy of his victims continues through various memorial and support programs that have been established in their honor. These initiatives work to prevent similar tragedies while providing support for families affected by violent crime. The story of Moses Sithole represents more than just the chronicle of a serial killer's crimes. It serves as a window into the complex social, psychological, and institutional factors that can combine to create individuals capable of extraordinary evil. His case illuminates the particular challenges faced by developing nations in combating sophisticated criminal behavior while dealing with limited resources and systemic problems. The transformation of a traumatized child into one of Africa's most notorious serial killers demonstrates how individual psychological damage can interact with broader social problems to create dangerous predators. The apartheid system's legacy of violence, poverty, and dehumanization provided the context within which Sithole's personal traumas developed into homicidal rage. His systematic targeting of vulnerable women revealed how social inequalities can be exploited by predators who understand the weaknesses in support systems and law enforcement responses. The fact that his victims were primarily poor, black women from marginalized communities made them easy targets who might not be immediately missed or whose disappearances might not generate intensive police responses. The investigation that eventually led to his capture demonstrated both the potential effectiveness of modern law enforcement techniques and the importance of adequate resources and training. The success in tracking and apprehending Sithole showed what could be accomplished when proper investigative methods were applied, while the initial difficulties highlighted the consequences of inadequate police systems. From a psychological perspective, Sithole's case continues to provide insights into the development of serial killers and the factors that can transform trauma victims into perpetrators of violence. His complete lack of empathy and his sophisticated understanding of victim psychology make him a particularly instructive case for those studying criminal behavior. The broader social impact of his crimes extends far beyond his individual victims to encompass entire communities that lived in fear during his killing spree. The terror he generated and the media attention his crimes received contributed to broader anxieties about crime and safety in post-apartheid South Africa. Today, more than 25 years after his capture, Moses Sithole remains a significant figure in the study of criminal behavior and the development of law enforcement techniques. His case continues to inform training programs, influence policy decisions, and provide insights for researchers seeking to understand and prevent similar crimes. The memory of his victims, women and children whose lives were cut short by his violence, deserves to be honored through continued efforts to improve victim protection and support services. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the importance of maintaining vigilant and effective criminal justice systems capable of protecting the most vulnerable members of society. In the end, the Moses Sithole case stands as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within individuals and the constant vigilance required to protect society from those who would exploit the vulnerable for their own gratification. His story continues to serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of valuable lessons for those working to prevent similar tragedies in the future.